Our next presenter, his name is David Hughes. He's going to be presenting his findings on the topic is questions not asked, 9/11 and the Academy. David Hughes received his MA from Christ Church in Oxford and also postgraduates from Worcester College in Oxford, and also holds a doctorate in German Studies and International Relations from Duke University and Oxford Brookes University, respectively. In 2013, he's taught international relations since 2013 at University of East Anglia, Royal Holloway, University of London, and Nottingham Trent University, and the University of Lincoln. And Dr. David Hughes, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to Piers as well for the invitation to speak today, and to UK Column for hosting this important event. In this presentation, I want to explore the propaganda function of academia in helping to sustain an official 9/11 narrative, which, though absurd, has for 2 decades served to legitimize the so-called war on terror. I will be citing various pieces of academic literature along the way, and the reference list can be found in the show notes on the UK Column website. The views contained in this presentation are strictly my own. It has been known for a very long time that the official account of 9/11, as presented in the 9/11 Commission report, as well as in reports by the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, is untrustworthy. In 2005, for instance, Professor David Ray Griffin published an important book titled The 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, in which he carefully exposes multiple flaws in the 9/11 Commission report. Even the 9/11 Commission's co-chairmen, Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton, conceded that the report was delayed, underfunded, obstructed, and, in their words, set up to fail. Much of it relies on testimony obtained under torture. This begs the question of why the US government sought to stymie a proper investigation into 9/11 and raises an obvious red flag concerning the official account of 9/11. If we could have slide 1, please. The most glaring omission from the 9/11 Commission report is the destruction of World Trade Center Building 7, a 47-story steel-framed skyscraper that was not hit by a plane, yet which spontaneously descended straight down into its own footprint in a manner clearly resembling controlled demolition. Building 7 is also left out of the 2005 NIST report. When NIST finally did address Building 7 in 2008, it came up with an explanation that relied on computer models which failed to imitate observed reality. NIST also tried hiding structural schematics of the building that render its explanation of the collapse impossible. So, no later than 2008, and in fact long before then, there was ample reason for academics to question the official version of 9/11. And indeed, some did. 2 edited volumes containing some major contributions appeared around that time. The Hidden History of 9/11, edited by Paul Zaremka, published in 2006, and 9/11 and American Empire, Intellectuals Speak Out, edited by David Ray Griffin and Peter Dale Scott, published in 2007. On the whole, however, there has been remarkably little academic literature willing to challenge the official account of 9/11. Despite the gigantic volume of scholarship on 9/11, Dr. Amy Benjamin observes, quote, "Almost all such studies assume the correctness of the core US claim of self-defense and then proceed to nibble on issues lying around its perimeter," end quote. In other words, the fundamental premise that Al-Qaeda attacked the United States is seldom questioned. This seems odd, given the known problems with the official account of 9/11 and the well-documented history of US false flag operations, i.e. staged attacks blamed on an official enemy in order to advance a political or military agenda. If we could have slide 2, please. In 2007, Emeritus Professor Morgan Reynolds wrote, quote, "The response of the academic community when the official conspiracy theory of 9/11 was challenged has been primarily a deafening silence, with a few notable exceptions," end quote. When asked in 2013 about academic research into the events of 9/11, Professor Graham McQueen replied, quote, "The universities are sleeping so soundly, you can hear the snoring from outer space," end quote. According to Emeritus Professor Kees van der Pijl in 2014, quote, "The event and its consequences have remained taboo," end quote, in academia. For Dr. John D. Wyndham in 2017, quote, "The great silence on 9/11 from the universities indicates that they are presently unable to examine this subject openly," end quote. According to Andrew Johnson of the Open University, quote, "For many who are more deeply embedded in the educational academic establishment, it seems that they are unable to confront or dispassionately analyse the evidence for themselves," end quote. Not all scholarship has turned away from asking critical questions about the events of 9/11. For example, there are 2 peer-reviewed journal articles plus 1 research paper which use econometric analysis to demonstrate that insider trading took place in the weeks leading up to 9/11. Other peer-reviewed journal articles by Benjamin, De Lint, and Van Gerwen et al. Explore respectively the legal implications of 9/11 being a false flag operation, the obstacles to conducting a proper criminal investigation of 9/11, and the abnormally high incidence of thyroid cancer in first responders. One of the most important contributions in recent years comes from Emeritus Professor David Ray Griffin, who, along with Elizabeth Woodworth, chaired the International 9/11 Consensus Panel, comprising 23 international experts. Over the course of 6 years, the panel painstakingly reviewed official claims regarding the events of 9/11. Following the scientific best evidence consensus model, which requires a minimum 85% consensus rate, it found the official account to be unsupportable on no fewer than 51 separate counts. Another landmark contribution was made in 2019 by Professor Leroy Hulsey of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Professor Hulsey headed a 4-year investigation into the destruction of Building 7, which concluded, quote, "Fire did not cause the collapse of WTC 7 on 9/11, contrary to the conclusions of NIST and private engineering firms that studied the collapse, and, quote, the collapse of WTC 7 was a global failure involving the near simultaneous failure of every column in the building," end quote. Thus, despite academia's hesitancy to address the events of 9/11, there is by now enough academically credible literature to prompt academics to look critically and open-mindedly at those events. This is essentially the case I make in a peer-reviewed journal article published last year, titled 9/11 and the Silence of the IR, or International Relations, Discipline. In it, I argue that international relations scholars uncritically accept the official 9/11 narrative and refuse to look at evidence that might challenge it. I note that in principle, the argument could be refuted by pointing to IR literature that does treat 9/11 as a possible false flag event based on analysis regarding what actually took place that day. 19 months later, no such literature has been brought to my attention. Therefore, my argument stands. No international relations scholar in 20 years has dared challenge the official 9/11 narrative. Could have slide 3, please. In my article, I draw on academically credible sources, including those mentioned, in order to present evidence that does challenge the official explanation of 9/11. In the process, I identify over 30 potential avenues of inquiry. There is no time to go through them all, but just to take the most contentious, consider the destruction of the Twin Towers. What exactly are we looking at here? Obviously, this is not a gravity-driven collapse, as we were told. Viewers will see clearly with their own eyes that material is being ejected outwards and even upwards in the places ringed with incredible force. In the words of Professor Stephen E. Jones, the towers were, quote, "turned mostly to powder in midair, that is, before hitting the ground." Although massive amounts of energy were released in the process, evident in the rapid expansion of the dust clouds that enveloped the whole of Lower Manhattan, no light or ionizing radiation were generated, and the dust clouds were cool, or at least not hot enough to burn the thousands of people caught up in them. What could possibly explain these observed effects? Different theories are in circulation, none of them wholly plausible to my mind. Academia's hesitancy to address the issue means that 20 years on, we still cannot say with any real confidence how the Twin Towers were destroyed. In my article, I propose various explanations of why academics have been reticent to challenge the official 9/11 narrative. For example, certain topics have been systematically excluded from mainstream media and political discourse, such that all debate and discussion remains confined to a spectrum of socially acceptable opinion. What David McGregor calls the establishment left is part of this. It will go so far in asking critical questions, but always within certain limits. For example, it might paint 9/11 as the inevitable blowback from US interference in the Middle East, yet it is quick to ridicule any suggestion that 9/11 was a false flag event. Then there is the neo-McCarthyite climate of fear and intimidation imposed after 9/11 that has cost several academics their jobs and seen others smeared by the mainstream media and bullied by their own universities for speaking out. Career incentives also come into play. Promotion in academia is typically dependent on securing external research funding, but the funders are typically rich and powerful organisations looking to advance their own interests by fashioning what Professor Inderjeet Palmer calls elite knowledge networks. It seems highly unlikely that funding will be made available for research that challenges establishment interests. Finally, there is cognitive dissonance. It can be psychologically very difficult to accept the implications of 9/11 not being what virtually all governments and mainstream media have spent the last 20 years telling the public it was. As Professor Michel Chossudovsky writes, quote, "The conclusions are difficult to accept because they point to the criminalization of the upper echelons of the state. They also confirm the complicity of the corporate media in upholding the legitimacy of the administration's war agenda and camouflaging US-sponsored war crimes." Slide 4, please. The response to my article from the academic community was extremely hostile. With no evidence of actually having read the article, dozens of academics instantly took to Twitter to claim that it should never have been sent out for review, that it represents, quote, "conspiracy theorizing of the worst kind," end quote, that everyone involved in its publication should be ashamed of themselves, that it is, quote, "a steaming pile of hot garbage," end quote, that the editorial board should resign, and that there should be a coordinated campaign to get it retracted. The journal editor even had to plead for the attacks to cease. What are we to make of this hostile reaction? Had my critics actually read the article, they would have known that it anticipates their knee-jerk resort to the conspiracy theorist smear. I write, as IR scholars really ought to know, the term conspiracy theory is weaponized. To dismiss 9/11 truth as conspiracy theory is not only intellectually lazy, supercilious, and uninformed, it is also the hallmark of vulnerability to a long-standing psychological warfare operation. Such an approach is unbecoming of serious scholarship. I also quote Dr. John D. Wyndham, who writes, quote, "As 9/11 research has shown in perhaps magnified form, the formal peer review process can be used as a weapon to bury opposing views and stifle independent research whose natural conclusions are in opposition to established or official narratives and vested interests." The response to my article confirms Wyndham's point. Thankfully, 2 full professors came swiftly to my defense, and I am most grateful to them. Professor Tim Haywood wrote a very thoughtful piece titled "Peer Review versus Trial by Twitter," in which he opined, quote, "My view is that the approach of these academics on Twitter is indefensible. They smear the author and the paper while seeking to intimidate the publisher and send a public message that this topic ought to remain off limits to any critical inquiry," end quote. Professor Bill Willers, in a piece titled "Regarding Ignoramuses in Academe," concludes, quote, "The disgraceful attack by the tweeting professors is a textbook example of condemnation before before investigation. The 4 and fellow academics who followed them with similar slurs display a rigidity of mind and a noxious commitment to official groupthink. They are beyond merely out of line. They represent a plague on freedom of scholarly inquiry and should be outed as the intellectual pariahs that they are." So, this appears to be the sorry state of academia when it comes to addressing the events of 9/11. There is no critical thinking about what actually took place that day, only groupthink and attempts to censor critical inquiry. Slide 5, please. Consider what those who defend the official 9/11 narrative are really saying about what they believe happened. They believe that two 110-story skyscrapers, weighing an estimated 1.5 million tons, slammed to the ground without killing the survivors on stairwell B or obliterating the underground structure of the World Trade Center complex. They believe that the upper floors accelerated through the lower floors, the path of maximum resistance, at approximately 2/3 the rate of gravity, and that this somehow also destroyed the 47 massive interlocking steel box columns at the core of each tower. They believe that the collapse of two 110-story buildings is consistent with the debris pile immediately close to ground level. They believe that two of the tallest buildings in the world disappeared in just over 10 seconds each, but that there is no reason to ask where they went. Slide 6, please. They believe that World Trade Center Building 7 was the first and only steel-framed fire-protected skyscraper in history to collapse solely due to office fires. Whereas, for instance, Grenfell Tower was engulfed by fire but remained standing, as one would expect of a steel-framed building, there were only isolated pockets of fire in WTC 7, yet the entire building came down in a manner obviously resembling a pre-planned controlled demolition. Slide 7, please. They believe that a Boeing 757 containing enough fuel for a transcontinental flight struck the Pentagon at ground level without damaging the lawn, initially causing only the damage shown on this composite image of photographs taken minutes after impact. They find nothing suspicious about the fact that the area hit contained the accounting officers, with Donald Rumsfeld having announced just the day before that the Pentagon could not account for $2.3 trillion of missing funds. Slide 8, please. They believe that the alleged pilot of Flight 77, Hani Hanjour, who was barely able to fly a single-engine Cessna, was able, in a Boeing 757, to perform a complex 330-degree downward corkscrew maneuver, descending 7,000 feet in 3 minutes, before slamming into one of the world's most heavily defended buildings at over 500 miles an hour. This was after Hanjour had managed to evade the attention of the US Air Force for 45 minutes, with the Twin Towers having already been struck. Slide 9, please. They believe that the crater in the top left of the screen was caused by a plane crash in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, but that the plane and all its contents, including the passengers, disappeared into a reclaimed strip mine, whereupon the crater instantly resealed itself, leaving no visible evidence of bodies or large chunks of debris. They believe that proven insider trading involving the shorting of airline stocks just before 9/11 had nothing to do with the attacks, that there was nothing suspicious about the BBC reporting on the collapse of Building 7 20 minutes before it happened, and that the decision to stage a record number of war games exercises on 9/11, creating maximum confusion for air traffic controllers, was just a coincidence. I could go on. The point is, however, that the official account of 9/11 is not only false, it is absurd, and it is risible. Academics should be laughing at it. Instead, they hunt in packs to attack anyone who dares question it. In the last 18 months, my article has been viewed or downloaded almost 22,000 times at the publisher's website and 1,500 times via my academia.edu site. This is despite attempts by social media companies to hide it using algorithms, as well as Wikipedia's instant deletion of any link to it. It has also been widely circulated and discussed by some high-profile websites, including Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Yet, despite the seriousness and urgency of the issues it raises, there has so far been no substantive scholarly engagement with it. It has been fleetingly cited by a handful of academic publications, but it has not provoked any meaningful academic discussion or debate about the events of 9/11 and their significance. Academia's silence regarding those events thus continues. Slide 10, please. For example, how did the academic subfield of critical terrorism studies mark the 20-year anniversary of 9/11? Was it by asking critical questions about the terrorist attacks of 9/11? No. In fact, 9/11 did not even feature in the title of this event held by the British International Studies Association, which instead referred to, quote, 20 years of war on terror, end quote. What actually happened is that Critical Terrorism Studies held a conference about itself, lauding its own groundbreaking research. I was most taken with the question, what is it missing? I proposed in my article 19 months ago that critical terrorism studies should pay more attention to possible and proven false flag operations by Western states. That topic did not appear on the conference agenda, however. The journal Critical Studies on Terrorism put out a special issue to mark the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. A critical terrorism studies approach to 9/11, according to the editor's introduction, means two things. First, reflecting on, quote, the duration, consequences, and costs of 9/11's aftermath, end quote. And second, questioning, quote, the widespread framing of those attacks as a powerful temporal marker, end quote. In other words, a critical terrorism studies approach to 9/11 means reflecting on everything that came after 9/11, or being critical of the idea that everything changed on 9/11, but, as I argue in my article, a serious scientific investigation of what exactly took place on 9/11, how it was achieved, and who could therefore have been responsible, remains strictly off limits. In conclusion, there is something sinister about the refusal of academics to subject the events of 9/11 to critical examination. While a sizable and growing proportion of the world's population has long had doubts about the official 9/11 narrative, academia has maintained a rigorous regime of self-censorship. It is no exaggeration to claim, as Elias Davidson does, that, quote, the willful avoidance of the questions surrounding 9/11 by the academic community verges on the pathological, end quote. Academia is complicit in legitimizing the very war on terror it claims to critique, insofar as it refuses to challenge the official 9/11 narrative on which that war is premised. Consider the consequences. Millions of people have been killed in the war on terror. There has been an aggressive worldwide expansion of US military power, including the introduction of drone warfare. The Middle East and North Africa region has been destabilized, leading to massive flows of migrants. International law has been repeatedly violated, most egregiously with the Iraq War. And there has been a draconian scaling back on civil liberties, including historically unprecedented levels of surveillance, arbitrary detention, and torture. Liberal democracy has been progressively hollowed out, laying the foundations for the global technocratic dictatorship currently seeking to install itself. The consequences of remaining silent on 9/11 indeed extend beyond the war on terror. Professor Daniel Brodie, in his later presentation, will discuss some of the continuities between 9/11 and COVID-19. With respect to the latter, Emeritus Professor Anthony James Hall wrote in private correspondence recently, reproduced here with his permission, quote, our colleagues in the universities who sanction this organized crime with their silence or with the production of propaganda disguised as social science are maybe even worse than mainstream journalists. So much of our current predicament leads back to the expedient embrace by lazy and/or corrupt journalists and academics of the completely absurd official explanation of the 9/11 debacle. These are strong words from an emeritus professor. Whatever one thinks about Hall's views on COVID-19, it is certainly true that failure to challenge an official 9/11 narrative that is demonstrably fraudulent opens the door for a corrupt ruling class to lie with impunity about whatever it wants. Silence in the face of tyranny amounts to consent, and collaboration is even worse. Anthony Daniels, writing under the pen name of Theodore Dalrymple, once claimed with respect to Soviet communism, quote, to assent to obvious lies is in some small way to become evil oneself. One standing to resist anything is thus eroded and even destroyed. A society of emasculated liars is easy to control. Or recall the words of Voltaire in 1767. Quote, certainly anyone who has the power to make you believe absurdities has the power to make you commit injustices. If you do not use the intelligence with which God endowed your mind to resist believing impossibilities, you will not be able to use the sense of injustice which God planted in your heart to resist a command to do evil. Once a single faculty of your soul has been tyrannized, all the other faculties will submit to the same fate. We should be under no illusion. The evil that was perpetrated on 9/11 and which has spread globally through the subsequent terror wars has been allowed to spread because of assent to obvious lies. As the 20th century showed, societies that are tyrannized into believing absurdities lose the capacity to resist commands to do evil. In Nazi Germany, academics ended up designing the gas chambers, running eugenics experiments, and planning the war of annihilation in the East. The lessons of history are stark, yet at a time when universities are moving rapidly towards mandating experimental injections with no long-term safety data as a condition of being allowed on campus, in flagrant violation of the Nuremberg Code, the warning signs are undeniable. Where things go from here, no one knows. However, a categorical refusal to believe in absurdities is surely an indispensable step in the fight to defend liberty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. David Hughes. Just one question I wanted to get you to expand a little bit on. You know, there's a lot of talk these days about the science. I put that in quotes, the science. How dangerous is it in the academy that if you don't have open inquiry, you've alluded to a sort of self-policing amongst academics, amongst the intellectuals in that community. Without open inquiry, does is this antithetical to the scientific method or to the principles of this science as we know it in the post Aristotelian or post Enlightenment era?
Absolutely, it is, Patrick. I mean, just in the COVID context, to give a couple of examples, when Professor Harvey Risch of Yale University published a peer-reviewed paper defending the use of hydroxychloroquine, he was rounded upon by, I think, 19 of his own colleagues at Yale who published an open letter denouncing him and his position. Similarly, at New York University, we've seen the gang up against Professor Mark Crispin Miller by his own colleagues simply for encouraging students to ask critical questions about the science of face mask wearing. And there was a similar thing at Stanford as well regarding Scott Atlas and another open letter. So I think what we're seeing now is a very worrying trend where true science, which of course the very essence of which is to entertain doubt and skepticism, is being heavily suppressed, and instead we're seeing this. I can only describe it as hunting in packs, and I think it's very dangerous, and that it's inimical to the true spirit of academia.
Thank you very much, Dr. David Hughes. We'll elaborate more on that particular contentious part of this discussion. Certainly, it features in quite a few other of the presenters' presentations this afternoon. But